Hi, I'm Rob Johnstone from Woodworkers Journal magazine, and today I'm going to teach you how to build this wall shelf. This is the third project in a series of basic woodworking videos where I teach people how to do woodworking, building on the techniques from the previous video. The last two projects in this series had some large similarities: joining legs to aprons, cutting square joints, and working with sub-assemblies. This wall shelf uses many of the same concepts, but with the wood pieces in different orientations. Here's what I mean. Here I'm joining end grain to edge grain, kind of like an apron to a leg, but in this case it's a shelf to a shelf side. And whereas I used dowels in the last project, this time I'm using pegs, which are kind of like dowels, but with a fat head. Let's get started. I've got 4 pieces of walnut material here. 2 I'm going to make into the shelves. And the 2 prettiest ones I'm going to make into the sides because they're the ones that will be the most visible. I'm going to clamp them in place here. You can lay out the curves at any diameter you would like, but here I'm using a common workshop trick. I'm using a round shape, my glue bottle here, to draw the curve, both at the top and at the bottom. Here on what will be the bottom, I use a square to complete the layout lines. Use a coping saw with a coarse blade to cut the curves. Follow the lines of the curves. Because the 2 sides are clamped together, the shapes will be the same. A fun detail is that because I used this bottle to shape the curves, I can use it as a sanding block to remove the saw marks. On the top curve, I use a regular sanding block. With the sides now machined up and cut to shape, I'm going to move on to the shelves. I need to cut them to length. As I did with the aprons in the last 2 projects, I'm going to cut one end square and then cut the board to length. Be sure to keep the waste pieces for later use. Now I need to lay out where the holes go to accept the pegs. You can find those locations by looking at the downloadable plan in the information below. Measure down from the top edge of the sides 6 inches and mark a line across both sides. Do the same from the bottom. Then locate the peg holes, measuring 1 1/4 inches in on each marked line. Use an awl or something like this screwdriver to make divots to help start your drill bit. Now it's time to drill the holes through the sides for the pegs. Now it's important that the drill bit be a little bit larger in diameter than the pegs. And it's also important that we drill through squarely, and we're going to use this block to do that. Place the bit in the divot and put the block next to it. Use the face of the block to align the drill front to back and the line to position it side to side. Then go ahead and drill your hole. Now that you have drilled the holes in the sides, you need to transfer those locations to the ends of the shelves in a way that properly positions them. Note that the top shelf is sitting on the 2 pieces of scrap you saved earlier. This holds it up 3/4 of an inch from the back edge of the shelf side. The center line from the outside of the shelf has been extended and a center line drawn on the ends of the shelf. I clamp the shelf in place, square to the work surface, and have the second shelf temporarily clamped between the sides as well. Now, bore the holes for the pegs. This drill bit should be the same diameter as the pegs, so they will fit tightly into the shelves. Mark the back of the shelves to keep position. Did you happen to notice this tape on my drill bit as I was working? I use it as a depth stop, and I set it at 1 3/4 inches. Now, another tip that I offer is that you should go ahead and stick your pegs into the holes here as you're working. They're too long now, but we can use this as our dry fit. Now I need to go on and drill the rest of the holes as I did before. Before assembling the sides and the shelves, it's time to do some sanding. I'll be using the same sanding technique I demonstrated in the last project, starting at 80 grit and sanding diagonally until all the machining marks are gone. Switching to 100 grit and working on the other diagonal until all the 80 grit marks are gone. Switch angles and move to 120 grit and remove the previous sanding marks. Next, move to 150 grit, but start sanding with the grain. Move to 180 grit, and you are done. But don't forget to sand the exposed edges. There's one more thing to do before we start to assemble, and that's we have to cut a bunch of these pegs down to their proper length. You can do that any way you want, but I found this to be a good way. You put it, I drilled a hole through these two pieces of scrap that you'll remember, and then I use it to hold the peg while I'm slicing. Cuts it to exactly the right 1.5 inch length. As you've already had these pieces clamped together, we can skip the dry fit step this time. Grab one side and slide the pegs up through the holes. Make sure you have the shelves in their proper place, and take one and apply glue to the peg holes and the end of the shelf. Be sparing with the glue on the shelf ends, as you don't want to smudge it onto the visible surfaces. Put the shelves onto the pegs and tap it down. Do the same with the next shelf. Now apply glue in the peg holes and the ends of the shelves. Grab the remaining side, put the pegs in their place, and lower the side, putting the pegs into their proper holes. Tap them down. Place the whole subassembly on its back and clamp it up. Make sure the glue up is square. Allow the glue to cure. You may be wondering why I recommended keeping the glue off the exposed surfaces. It's because we're going to be using an oil finish on this, and if there's glue on there, when you put the oil on, like this, there's glue on there, it'll show up as a smudge, and then you'd have to sand it off to make it right. But as you can see, I could have done a better job. I guess I'll be doing some extra sanding. So while the glue is curing, you can go ahead and cut out the plywood back. You can get the basic side from the material list, but anytime you are fitting a piece into a fixed space, you need to measure the space to be certain. Transfer that dimension to the plywood and cut the back to size. Now we need to find the locations for the screws that will attach the back to the shelves. Put the back piece on your work surface. Place the shelf assembly over the top. Align the top shelf with the back, then sketch light lines to locate the shelf positions on the back. Drill holes through the plywood for your screws. Put the back in place on the shelf subassembly and drive the screws home. The plywood is soft enough that you don't need to countersink the holes. Now, remove the screws and the back. I can almost hear you asking, why'd you take the pieces apart? Well, this time out we're going to be talking about finishing, and to do the finishing properly, I need the pieces to be separate. You've sanded the parts of the shelf subassembly smooth, so all we need to do now is apply an oil finish. Oil, like the product here from General, really pops the grain and is easy to touch up. All you need to do is flood it on and wipe it off. But this is important. Lay the oil-soaked rags out flat and allow them to dry. If you wad them up, they could catch fire. Next, I'm painting the plywood. Sand the panel gently and smooth the edges. It's best practice to apply a coat of paint on both sides of the plywood. On the show face, gently sand after the first coat dries and then apply a second coat. Once the oil and the paint have dried, you can reassemble it and you've completed the project. Now, if you've never mounted a shelf on the wall, I recommend you look up some YouTube videos and learn how to do it properly so you can anchor it safely. And finally, the shelf is made even more functional by adding the hooks to the back. Space them evenly across the opening. They also look great. Congratulations. By completing this project, you learned how to lay out curves and cut them with a coping saw, lay out precise locations for drilling holes, how to bore a hole square to the board, how to locate hidden screws, mount functional hardware, and a couple of things about finishing. I'm Rob Johnstone from Woodworker's Journal. Thanks for watching.